The sun is rising over the Pacific Ocean on November 20th, 1943. The warm, tropical breeze brushes the faces of the U.S. Marines aboard the landing crafts as they near the shores of Battle Island in the Tarawa Atoll. Their eyes are focused, but their thoughts are scattered, nervous, determined, uncertain. The sound of engines roars in the distance, mixing with the rhythmic slap of waves against the crafts. This is the first wave, the tip of the spear in America's relentless push across the Pacific. The men are ready, but the island before them is a fortress. Rows of Japanese defensive positions, some carved into the coral itself, lie waiting, shrouded in the mist of the morning. Just ahead, the beach is lined with tangled barbed wire, concrete pillboxes, and gun emplacements. For months, the Japanese have held this tiny speck of land, and they are prepared to defend it to the death. The Marines have been briefed. This battle will be different. This will not be like the soft landings of Guadalcanal or the minimal resistance of smaller islands. They are entering a living hell. On the Japanese side, the defenders are equally certain of one thing. The U.S. Marines, despite their numbers, will falter. But little do they know, what lies ahead will force them to feel the full wrath of American firepower, unleashing a storm they could never have imagined. In 1943, the Pacific War had reached a pivotal moment. The United States, having endured the shock of Pearl Harbor and a series of early setbacks, was now firmly on the offensive. The Japanese Imperial Army, stretched thin across vast territories, had begun to show signs of vulnerability. Yet, for all the momentum the Allies had gained in the Pacific, the road to victory was still paved with heavy fighting and sacrifice. At the heart of this strategy lay the island-hopping campaign, an ambitious plan designed to bypass heavily fortified Japanese positions and instead focus on strategically vital islands. By doing so, the U.S. hoped to sever Japan's supply lines and pave the way for an eventual assault on the Japanese homeland. Each island was a stepping stone, with its own set of defenses and challenges. One such island was Battle, located in the Tarawa Atoll. Situated in the Central Pacific, Battle was a key Japanese outpost. It was here that the U.S. Marines would face one of the toughest and most brutal tests of their combat prowess. The island, only 2.5 miles long and half a mile wide, was heavily fortified with a complex network of pillboxes, gun emplacements, and obstacles. Battle's strategic importance was not immediately apparent to those who viewed it from a distance. For many, it was merely another speck on a map. But for the Japanese, it was a linchpin in their defense strategy. Should it fall, it would open the door for Allied forces to advance closer to Japan and threaten their vital lines of communication. The Japanese had reinforced Tarawa with thousands of soldiers, underestimating the capability of the American forces. The Marines had learned much from previous engagements, particularly the bloody lessons of Guadalcanal and New Guinea. Yet no amount of preparation could fully prepare them for what awaited them on Battle. From the Japanese perspective, however, the situation was clear. They had been observing the American push through the Pacific and felt confident that the Marines' attempts to capture the island would fail. The defenders of Tarawa, led by Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, had been given orders to hold the island at all costs. They believed the American assault would be a costly failure, and many within the Imperial Navy saw the U.S. Marines as relatively inexperienced, easy targets for well-established defensive positions. Japanese officials, including Shibasaki, were convinced that they could easily repel the invasion. This arrogance would prove to be a catastrophic misjudgment. By mid-November 1943, the stage was set for the clash at Battle. The U.S. had assembled a formidable force to launch the invasion, comprising more than 35,000 Marines, supported by naval and air power. But despite their preparation and the overwhelming numbers, the Americans would soon discover the true scale of the challenge ahead. The invasion of Tarawa would set the stage for a battle unlike any that had come before. It would test the resilience of the Marines, the might of American weaponry, and the indomitable will to win against a deeply entrenched enemy. As the U.S. Marines prepared to land on Betio, the broader strategic context of the Pacific War weighed heavily on both sides. For the United States, the Battle of Tarawa was part of a much larger campaign to neutralize Japan's defensive perimeter and ultimately pave the way for an invasion of the Japanese homeland. The island's capture was necessary not only for its location, but also as a vital step in securing the Central Pacific, which would open up the path to the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, and the ultimate assault on Japan itself. In Washington, the urgency of the situation was clear. After a year of bloody island hopping, the U.S. Navy had secured several smaller islands, but the next move required a much larger operation. The Japanese had established strong defensive positions across the Pacific, and it was evident that they would not surrender easily. The Battle of Tarawa, therefore, was not just a fight for an isolated island. It was a test of the U.S. military's evolving tactics and the ability to overcome entrenched defenses. The leadership of the U.S. military was acutely aware of the stakes. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, understood that success at Tarawa would send a strong message to both the Allies and the Japanese. General Holland Smith, the officer in charge of the Marine Corps' amphibious forces, also saw the battle as a chance to prove the effectiveness of new techniques and equipment, which would be crucial in the coming campaigns. However, despite the high level of preparation, there were significant challenges to overcome. The primary concern for the Marines was the lack of accurate intelligence about the Japanese defenses. Tarawa had been heavily fortified, but the exact nature of those fortifications was not fully understood until the invasion force arrived. What the Marines had assumed would be a relatively straightforward amphibious assault would quickly turn into a brutal, close-quarters battle. The Japanese, under the command of Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, were resolute in their determination to hold the island. Shibasaki had been given strict orders from Tokyo to defend Betio at all costs. This was no ordinary island outpost. It was an integral part of Japan's defensive strategy in the Central Pacific. Shibasaki's forces had entrenched themselves deep within the island's coral terrain, using the island's natural geography to their advantage. They dug in, creating a network of pillboxes, trenches, and machine gun nests. The Japanese believed their defenses were impenetrable. The Marines, they assumed, would land, only to be torn apart by the extensive firepower concentrated along the beaches. But the Japanese were also hampered by their own miscalculations. They had placed much of their defensive strength on the beach itself, with less focus on the island's interior, where the Marines would eventually find opportunities to break through. Additionally, Japanese soldiers on Tarawa were underprepared for the fierce American naval and air bombardments that preceded the landing. The bombardment, which lasted for several days, had little effect on the well-constructed Japanese defenses. Despite the overconfidence in their positions, the Japanese defenders at Betio had no illusions about the brutality of the upcoming fight. The battle was set to be a bloody affair, but both sides were unaware of how the course of the battle would change once the first Marines set foot on the beach. The Marines, for their part, were mentally preparing for what would be the toughest fight of their careers. The lessons learned from previous battles, particularly Guadalcanal, had hardened their resolve, but no amount of preparation could truly anticipate the devastating challenges they would face in the first few hours of the battle. As the landing crafts approached the shore, the Marines knew one thing for certain. This would not be a conventional fight. This would be a battle of attrition. one that would test every ounce of their strength and ingenuity. With everything in place, and both sides ready for the inevitable confrontation, the invasion force set sail. On the morning of November 20th, 1943, the U.S. Marines would land on Betio, setting in motion a battle that would forever alter the course of the Pacific War. Human angle. The Marines' experience. The American Marines who landed on Betio were hardened, but no amount of training or preparation could shield them from the raw horror they would soon face. They were young men, many still in their 20s, eager to prove themselves but equally terrified of the violence that awaited them. Some had fought in earlier island battles, like Guadalcanal, but for others, this would be their first real test of combat. The moments leading up to the landing were filled with a palpable tension, a mix of anticipation, fear, and resolve. As the landing crafts neared the shore, Marines could hear the sound of machine gun fire in the distance. The roar of American naval bombardment echoed across the water, but it was clear that it had done little to stop the determined defenders of Tarawa. The heavy fog of war descended upon them. There was no turning back. The moment the ramp dropped, they were thrust into chaos. The first few seconds on the beach were a blur. Marines scrambled off the landing crafts into chest-deep water, clutching their rifles and equipment, making a desperate dash for the relative cover of the shoreline. But the beach, now a killing field, was lined with obstacles: barbed wire, tank traps, and craters from the failed bombardment. Japanese machine gunners and riflemen, hidden in pillboxes and trenches, opened fire. In those first few minutes, the Marines were confronted by an unrelenting storm of lead and shrapnel. Men fell all around them, the sounds of their screams and the rhythmic crack of enemy fire filling the air. The Marines were forced to improvise, crawling under cover, flanking enemy positions, and using every ounce of ingenuity to stay alive. The sense of camaraderie among the Marines was palpable as they supported each other through the horror. For many, this moment marked the true beginning of their transformation, away from the idealized notion of heroism to the harsh reality of war. What was most striking to these Marines, though, was the realization that the battle for Betio was a fight for survival, not glory. Victory could only be achieved by moving forward, no matter the cost. For many, this would be the most harrowing experience of their lives, a moment that would stay with them forever. Tactical angle. The assault strategy. The U.S. Marines had an ambitious plan for the assault on Betio. The landing would be the first phase of a coordinated attack designed to secure the island, beginning with a massive naval bombardment. The aim was to soften up Japanese defenses and create breaches in their fortifications. Behind this initial strike, amphibious landing crafts, accompanied by tanks, would advance toward the beach, followed by waves of infantry to mop up remaining enemy positions. However, the U.S. had underestimated the Japanese' ability to withstand the bombardment. Despite hours of intense naval and aerial bombardment, many of the island's defenders remained entrenched. The well-constructed concrete pillboxes and tunnels built into the coral absorbed much of the damage, leaving the Japanese soldiers relatively unscathed. When the Marines began to land, they were met with ferocious resistance. The Marines' tactics were based on previous successes in the Pacific, where they had employed the use of landing craft, which could transport troops and vehicles directly onto the beaches. But on Betio, the terrain worked against them. The shallow waters near the beach, combined with coral reefs, made it difficult for the landing crafts to reach the shore efficiently. As a result, many Marines were forced to wade ashore, making them vulnerable to enemy fire. Once ashore, the Marines quickly adapted their tactics. They deployed smoke screens and used flamethrowers to clear enemy positions. Mortar teams and machine gun units laid down suppressive fire to pin down Japanese positions, while tanks, supported by infantry, pushed inland to break through the island's defenses. The Marines, known for their adaptability, had to adjust to the rugged, unforgiving terrain and the devastating firepower of the Japanese defenders. Despite the challenges, the assault plan began to show promise. The Marines' ability to push forward, despite the constant barrage of machine gun fire and artillery shells, was a testament to their training and resolve. Slowly but surely, they began to make progress, securing small portions of the island with each passing hour. But the price for every inch of ground was steep, and the Marines quickly realized that they would need every ounce of firepower, endurance, and ingenuity to achieve victory. Technological angle: U.S. firepower and innovation. The United States brought a wealth of technological advancements to the Battle of Tarawa, leveraging cutting-edge equipment that had been honed in the Pacific's grueling island campaigns. Among the most vital pieces of equipment were the amphibious landing crafts, LVTS, landing vehicle tracked, which could traverse the rough surf and deliver Marines to the shore. These vehicles were crucial to the assault, providing the Marines with a means to transport their gear across the treacherous reef that lined Betio's beaches. The landing craft themselves, heavily armored and slow-moving, became targets for Japanese fire as they moved toward the shore, but they proved indispensable to the invasion's success. In addition to the LVTS, the Marines employed the M4 Sherman tank, which, despite being somewhat outdated, played a key role in the assault. The tanks were specially modified for amphibious landings, enabling them to drive straight from the landing crafts onto the beach. Once on the shore, these tanks were used to knock out machine gun positions and break through the dense network of Japanese defenses. Despite being vulnerable to Japanese anti-tank weapons, the Shermans were an essential force multiplier on the battlefield, providing much-needed fire support in the close-quarters combat of the landing. Another vital technological asset was the use of naval and aerial firepower. The U.S. Navy's warships had shelled Betio relentlessly in the days leading up to the landing, but their impact had been less significant than hoped. The Japanese fortifications, built into the island's coral, absorbed much of the damage. Nevertheless, the battleships, cruisers, and destroyers continued to provide supporting fire throughout the battle, unleashing devastating salvos of shells into Japanese positions. Meanwhile, American aircraft, including bombers and fighters, launched repeated sorties to soften up the enemy and provide cover for the Marines as they advanced inland. Despite the heavy firepower, the Marines quickly realized that their technological advantages, though significant, were not a guarantee of success. The Japanese defenders were well prepared, and the rugged terrain of Betio provided them with formidable natural defenses. As the battle raged on, the technological superiority of the U.S. forces was tested like never before. It became clear that the real power lay not just in advanced weaponry, but in the Marines' ability to adapt and innovate in response to the enemy's relentless resistance. Enemy angle: the Japanese defense and miscalculations. On the Japanese side, the defense of Tarawa was a calculated but ultimately flawed strategy. The Japanese had made significant efforts to fortify Betio, but their confidence in the strength of their defenses blinded them to the full potential of American firepower. Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, the commander of the Japanese forces on Betio, had been tasked with holding the island at all costs. His forces, around 4,500 men, had dug in deep, creating an intricate network of pillboxes, machine gun positions, and underground tunnels. They believed that these defenses would hold the Marines long enough to repel the invasion. However, the Japanese had made several critical miscalculations. They had assumed that the American landing would be much like those on previous islands, where beach assaults were met with weaker or less prepared defenses. The Japanese thought they could create a stronghold by concentrating their firepower along the beaches and coastal areas. What they didn't anticipate was the sheer firepower the U.S. would bring to bear, both from the sea and the air. The Americans had brought a level of technology and firepower that the Japanese simply could not match, especially when it came to the support provided by naval and aerial bombardments. Moreover, the Japanese forces underestimated the resolve and adaptability of the U.S. Marines. Despite suffering devastating casualties in the early hours of the assault, the Marines pushed forward relentlessly. The Japanese soldiers were caught off guard by the tenacity of the attackers, who quickly adjusted their tactics in the face of overwhelming odds. While the Japanese defenders believed they could hold out until reinforcements arrived, they were slowly isolated and overwhelmed by the American onslaught. Another significant miscalculation was the Japanese failure to properly reinforce Batio. While the Japanese had fortified the island, they had not provided adequate reinforcements or resources to support the defense once the battle began. Shibasaki's forces were left to fend for themselves, and many were poorly equipped and exhausted by the time the Marines landed. Japanese soldiers had also been demoralized by the intense naval bombardment, which had disrupted their supply lines and rendered their positions vulnerable. The result was a fierce but ultimately futile defense. As the battle raged on, it became increasingly clear that the Japanese forces, despite their defensive preparations, were no match for the overwhelming power of the U.S. Marines and their technological superiority. The cost of this miscalculation would be devastating, as the Japanese defenders would be forced to face the full brunt of American firepower, leading to their eventual defeat on the island. The battle for Batio reached its turning point on the morning of November 22, 1943, just 2 days after the initial landings. By this time, the U.S. Marines had gained a tenuous foothold on the island, but the situation was far from secure. The beaches were strewn with the bodies of the fallen, both American and Japanese, as the battle raged on. The relentless fighting had taken its toll on both sides, but the Marines had begun to push inland inch by inch, their determination unwavering despite the overwhelming resistance. The decisive moment came when the U.S. Marines, aided by artillery and air support, launched a concentrated assault on the heart of the Japanese defenses. Batio's defenses had been designed to withstand a traditional assault, but the Marines quickly adapted, deploying smoke screens and utilizing flamethrowers to clear Japanese positions. Despite the devastating losses they had already suffered, the Marines pressed forward, using their mobility and firepower to outflank the entrenched Japanese defenders. It was in these pivotal hours that the Marines began to gain control of the key objectives on the island: the airfield and the Japanese command center. These areas had been heavily fortified, and their capture was critical to breaking the back of the Japanese resistance. The Marines, battered and bloodied, fought their way through narrow trenches and dense underbrush, facing entrenched Japanese machine gun nests, anti-tank positions, and the constant threat of artillery fire. At the same time, the Japanese defenders, though determined, were starting to realize that their defenses had been breached. Admiral Shibasaki, whose initial confidence had been shattered by the overwhelming American assault, could no longer hold out hope for a successful counterattack. The Japanese forces were now isolated, with no reinforcements arriving and no way to resupply their positions. As the hours wore on, their morale began to crumble, and the ferocity of their resistance began to wane. The breakthrough came when a Marine unit, supported by Sherman tanks, managed to breach the perimeter around the Japanese command center. Once inside, the Marines found themselves in a brutal fight for control of the final strongholds. Japanese soldiers, trapped in their pillboxes and bunkers, fought to the death, but the writing was on the wall. The American onslaught was unstoppable, and the Japanese defenders, though fierce, were simply overwhelmed. It was in this moment of intense close combat, amid the crack of rifle fire and the deafening roar of exploding shells, that the full scale of the battle became clear. The Marines were not just fighting for a piece of land. They were fighting to prove the effectiveness of their tactics, the strength of their resolve, and the power of American firepower. With each step forward, the Marines were breaking the spirit of the Japanese defenders, who had underestimated them so profoundly. In these final hours of the battle, the American forces had turned the tide. The key positions had been secured, the Japanese forces were in retreat, and the Marines had achieved what seemed impossible just days before. Tarawa would fall. The victory, however, came at a high cost. Casualties on both sides were staggering, and the island was left in ruins, a grim testament to the intensity of the conflict. But for the United States, the Battle of Tarawa marked a major turning point in the Pacific War. It demonstrated that, despite the challenges, the U.S. could successfully execute amphibious assaults against even the most heavily fortified positions. As the afternoon of November 22nd stretched into evening, the Japanese defenses at Battle began to crumble under the relentless pressure from the U.S. Marines. The final pockets of resistance, often entrenched in the island's coral hills and fortified bunkers, were systematically neutralized. Despite the fierce fighting, the U.S. Marines continued to push forward, driven by the singular goal of seizing the island, no matter the cost. The most decisive action occurred as the Marines launched a final full-scale assault on the Japanese command center, a critical stronghold on Battle. Located near the heart of the island, the command post had been heavily fortified with concrete pillboxes, anti-aircraft guns, and a network of defensive tunnels. The Japanese defenders, realizing their desperate situation, fought with all the ferocity of cornered animals, but their efforts were no match for the overwhelming firepower and tenacity of the Marines. Amidst the heavy bombardment and close-quarters combat, the Marines deployed flamethrowers to destroy the remaining Japanese positions, clearing out entrenched soldiers who had nowhere to retreat. The Marines' strategic use of smoke screens, combined with their overwhelming air and naval support, allowed them to neutralize the most stubborn pockets of resistance. As they advanced into the heart of the Japanese defenses, the final bastion of opposition came in the form of the fortified pillboxes. These concrete structures, once considered impenetrable, were now falling one by one under the Marines' sustained attacks. The Japanese, realizing the situation was hopeless, began to surrender, but not without a final, desperate fight. Many chose to die with their comrades rather than face capture. The final casualties of the battle came as Marine forces closed in on the last remnants of resistance. The U.S. Marines' unyielding advance, despite the heavy losses they had sustained, had turned the tide. By November 23rd, the majority of Battle had been secured, and the Japanese defenders, now reduced to small groups of scattered, disorganized forces, had no choice but to retreat or face annihilation. The surrender of the Japanese forces on Battle came as the Marines began to secure the airfield, marking the symbolic end of the battle. The Marines' victory had been hard-earned, and it was clear that the assault had cost the U.S. dearly. But in that moment, the significance of the victory could not be overstated. Tarawa was the first major amphibious assault of the Pacific War, where U.S. Marines faced a fully prepared, determined enemy in heavily fortified positions. The ability of the U.S. military to adapt and ultimately succeed against such formidable defenses signaled a shift in the Pacific conflict. The Japanese had been forced to learn, the hard way, that underestimating American firepower, tactics, and resolve could lead to disastrous consequences. In the days following the battle, the full scale of the American victory became clear. More than 1,000 U.S. Marines had died in the assault, with over 2,000 wounded. The Japanese losses were far higher. Almost 4,500 men had been killed, with only a few dozen taken prisoner. The battle's brutality left Betio a devastated wasteland, its beaches littered with wrecked landing crafts and the corpses of both American and Japanese soldiers. Yet despite the staggering cost, the victory at Tarawa had an undeniable strategic impact. It secured the Central Pacific for the United States, weakened the Japanese hold on the region, and provided valuable lessons for future amphibious operations. The battle had proven that the U.S. Marines could overcome even the most heavily fortified positions, setting the stage for further successful campaigns across the Pacific. But as the Marines paused to reflect on their victory, they could not forget the toll it had taken. The victory at Tarawa marked a crucial step forward in the Pacific War, but it was a sobering reminder of the brutal realities of the island-hopping strategy that would define the conflict in the months and years to come. The Battle of Tarawa, though a decisive victory for the United States, came at an incredibly high cost. The Marines had secured the island, but the cost in lives and resources was staggering. The total number of American casualties exceeded 3,000, with over 1,000 killed in action and more than 2,000 wounded. The toll was even more severe among the Japanese defenders, who suffered almost total annihilation. Of the 4,500 Japanese soldiers on Betio, fewer than 100 were taken prisoner, and the rest were either killed in combat or died in the aftermath of the battle. The carnage left the island, once a tropical paradise, a desolate and devastated landscape. The images of American casualties, Marines whose bodies lay lifeless on the blood-soaked beaches of Betio, became a grim symbol of the high stakes of the Pacific War. The sight of so many young men sacrificed in a single brutal engagement was a powerful reminder of the human cost of war. Among the Marines, the battle's emotional toll was profound. Many had lost friends, comrades they had fought alongside in previous campaigns. For some, Tarawa marked their first battle, and it would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Despite these heavy losses, the U.S. military leadership viewed the victory at Tarawa as a necessary and critical step in the island-hopping campaign. The island's strategic position in the Central Pacific could not be overstated. By securing Betio, the U.S. gained control of a vital airfield, which would serve as a staging ground for future assaults on the Mariana Islands and beyond. The capture of Tarawa was seen as a key step in the broader strategy to isolate Japan and eventually force its surrender. For the Japanese, the aftermath of Tarawa was a devastating blow to their confidence and defensive strategy. The battle exposed significant flaws in their defensive planning, particularly the underestimation of American firepower and the Marines' ability to adapt to the challenges of amphibious warfare. Tarawa was the first major battle where the Japanese faced the full force of U.S. naval, air, and land power in a coordinated assault. It shattered their belief that their island fortifications could withstand such overwhelming force. The psychological impact on the Japanese military was profound. The loss of Betio and the annihilation of nearly their entire force there sent shockwaves through the Imperial Army and Navy. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, Japanese leaders reevaluated their defensive strategies, realizing that they could not continue to rely solely on heavily fortified island positions. This shift in thinking would later influence the course of the war, as Japan began to focus more on defending the home islands rather than trying to hold every island in the Pacific. The battle also had a profound impact on both U.S. and Japanese tactics. The Marines, though they had won, were forced to confront the realities of amphibious warfare in the Pacific. They learned valuable lessons about the effectiveness of naval gunfire and aerial bombardment, but they also realized that these alone would not ensure victory. The brutal close-quarters combat on Betio demonstrated the need for better coordination between air, land, and sea forces, and it set the stage for the refinement of tactics that would later be applied in battles like Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. For the U.S. Navy, the victory at Tarawa underscored the importance of logistical preparation. The difficulty of navigating the shallow reefs surrounding the island, combined with the vulnerability of landing crafts to enemy fire, highlighted the need for better amphibious assault vehicles and more effective landing strategies. The battle also exposed flaws in the Navy's bombardment tactics, as the bombardment prior to the invasion had done little to neutralize the Japanese defenses, a lesson that would influence future naval operations in the Pacific. In the weeks that followed, Tarawa became a symbol of American resolve, but also a cautionary tale. The Marines had triumphed, but the cost had been immense. The battle's aftermath reverberated across the Pacific as both sides began to reassess their strategies in preparation for the next phase of the war. In the weeks following the capture of Tarawa, the full consequences of the battle became increasingly clear. The American victory, though strategically significant, was also a stark reminder of the brutality of the Pacific War. Despite their triumph, the Marines' victory came at a tremendous cost in terms of human life and resources. The island, once teeming with life, was now a wasteland, its beaches littered with the remains of the battle, and its airfield shattered by relentless bombardment. The devastation was not just physical, it was psychological. For many Marines, the images of the battle would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the larger context of the Pacific War, the victory at Tarawa had profound strategic ramifications. The capture of Betio provided the U.S. military with an essential base of operations for future campaigns in the Central Pacific. The airfield, though damaged in the fighting, was soon operational, allowing for the deployment of additional forces and supplies. This success would serve as a springboard for further operations, most notably the subsequent invasions of the Marshall Islands and the Marianas, which would bring the Allies closer to Japan's home islands. However, Tarawa also taught the U.S. military harsh lessons about the realities of amphibious warfare. The Marines' assault on Betio had shown the limits of American technological superiority. The heavily fortified Japanese defenses, despite being subjected to days of bombardment, had proven remarkably resilient. The Marines quickly realized that even overwhelming firepower would not guarantee victory. Tarawa was a reminder that a battle could be won not just by superior firepower, but by the ability to adapt to the unpredictable and unforgiving nature of combat. In terms of logistics, the operation revealed critical vulnerabilities in the U.S. approach to amphibious invasions. The shallow coral reefs surrounding Betio posed a serious challenge to the landing crafts, forcing many Marines to wade ashore under fire. The Marines' failure to neutralize all of the Japanese defenses during the pre-landing bombardment also emphasized the importance of more effective intelligence and better coordination between naval, air, and ground forces. The battle demonstrated the need for better planning in terms of both landing techniques and post-landing operations. For the Japanese, the loss of Tarawa marked a significant shift in their strategic thinking. The battle revealed the limits of their defensive strategy, which had relied heavily on entrenched positions and island fortifications. The defeat at Tarawa underscored the fact that the U.S. military had learned from its earlier setbacks and was now more than capable of overcoming heavily fortified defenses. The battle was a wake-up call for the Japanese military, forcing them to reconsider their approach to island defense. However, despite the brutal loss at Tarawa, the Japanese leadership would continue to pursue the strategy of defending every island at all costs, a decision that would ultimately lead to further costly defeats in the Pacific, particularly on islands like Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. In the aftermath of Tarawa, the Pacific campaign accelerated. The U.S. military having gained a valuable foothold in the Central Pacific, was able to pivot its focus toward the Mariana Islands. These islands were of even greater strategic importance, offering the U.S. the ability to launch long-range bombers capable of striking Japan's home islands. The lessons learned at Tarawa, particularly in terms of amphibious assault tactics, would directly influence subsequent operations and contribute to the eventual success of the island-hopping campaign. Yet, despite the tactical and strategic victories won at Tarawa, the emotional and psychological costs of the battle remained. For the Marines who had fought and bled on Batio, the island would never be forgotten. Many would return home physically scarred, while others would bear invisible wounds that would take years to heal. The brutal, intimate nature of the battle, with its relentless close-quarters combat and heavy casualties, left an indelible mark on all who participated. For the families of the fallen, the loss of so many young men was a personal tragedy that underscored the high human cost of the war. The images of the bodies of American Marines scattered across the beaches of Batio became a haunting reminder of the sacrifices made in the name of victory. Yet despite the bloodshed, the U.S. emerged from the battle stronger, more unified, and more determined than ever to continue the fight toward ultimate victory in the Pacific. The Battle of Tarawa stands as a somber chapter in the Pacific War, a stark reminder of the brutality of warfare and the immense sacrifices made by both sides. Its legacy is one of resilience, adaptation, and the high cost of victory. For the United States, Tarawa marked a significant turning point in the island-hopping campaign, a bold assertion of American firepower and the Marines' ability to overcome seemingly insurmountable odds. Yet, the victory came at a tremendous human cost. Over 1,000 American lives were lost, and thousands more were wounded. The island was left in ruins, a grim testament to the ferocity of the battle. For the Japanese, the battle was a crushing blow to their defensive strategy. The loss of Batio exposed critical vulnerabilities in their ability to defend their empire against the overwhelming force of the U.S. military. It forced Japan to rethink its approach to island defense, although too late to change the course of the war. The defenders of Tarawa, fierce, determined, but ultimately doomed, became symbols of a military that was willing to fight to the last man, yet found itself unable to withstand the tide of modern warfare. In the broader scope of history, the battle at Tarawa was more than just a military victory. It was a moment that reshaped the course of the Pacific conflict. The lessons learned in the brutal fight for Batio were applied to future campaigns across the Pacific, from Saipan to Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Each battle, building on the last, brought the United States closer to Japan's home islands. But as the U.S. pressed on, the human cost continued to mount. The Marines who had fought at Tarawa knew better than anyone that victory was not without its price. Tarawa, ultimately, was a battle that not only tested the strength of men, but also the strength of nations. It marked the high point of American military ingenuity and willpower, yet it was also a reminder that war, no matter the victory, leaves scars that endure long after the fighting stops. As the Pacific War raged on, the legacy of Tarawa would resonate in the hearts of those who fought, ensuring that the cost of freedom would never be forgotten. Through the shattered beaches and the burned-out ruins of Batio, the echoes of those who fought there would endure in the annals of history as a testament to the bravery, sacrifice, and unyielding spirit that defined the greatest struggle of the 20th century.